over to Rich Allen, co-founder of Leave Wizard. I'm guessing owner of Conjurer Solutions Limited, but here with us at Agile South Coast today to talk about From 4 to 40, a journey through every Agile concept I've ever heard of at PureGym. Is that right?
Pretty much in a nutshell, yeah, we can all go home.
Okay, Rich,
Awesome.
over to you.
Cool. Thank you very much, Stephen, and thank you very much for having me here at Agile South Coast. I've not been along for a long time. Unfortunately, normally this session doesn't work for me when I've got to travel up to Southampton, but remotely, perfect. We can manage that. So it's the second time I've done this talk. Previously it was at Developer South Coast, and it is more developer focused. Obviously you guys are a bit more into the process, so hopefully actually there's a few concepts in here you'll be going, yeah, know that, and I know that, but there may also be some new stuff. But if you've got any questions, feel free to, as Stephen says, make notes of them, and then we'll have a discussion later. But there'll be lots of acronyms and names and process introductions and things. But to kick us off, let's just do a quick intro to who I am. So as Stephen said, I'm owner of LeaveWizard.com. I actually co-founder with Plum and Balpansky, which I believe you guys are fully aware of, and came and spoke to you about some of our story on that a few months ago. Head of consulting and owner of Conjurer Solutions, which is my consulting arm. Also founder of Developer South Coast. I no longer run it. I managed to hand that over to a fine and dandy group of individuals who now run that, and it's going great guns. So we ran that for 13 years, I think. It's time to hang up the music group apron and move on. And I'm also a father of three. There's 5 of us here in Bournemouth, and we live by the beach. It's all good. So to move on then, hopefully everyone on the call knows this. Agile is a journey and it's not a destination. So this particular talk is about the Agile journey that we took when I was part of the team at PureGym over a period of 4 years, and we'll kind of touch on processes we implemented in the beginning, and then some of the lessons learned as we developed the team and started to grow. If anyone fancies it, you can do a bit of buzzword bingo. I'm sure there'll be plenty. As we all know, there's lots of Agile concepts and acronyms and names will be cropping up this evening. Feel free to shout house at any time if you feel that we hit on any of those. So a little bit about PureGym. So PureGym, if you don't know, is hopefully it's still the largest gym chain in the UK. Obviously, they were doing really well. One of the fastest growing companies in the UK, up until a certain thing happened that meant no one could go to gyms and they had to close. But prior to that, they had grown from 70 gyms to 250, and still growing and growing and looking to go international. They were looking to break into the US market, and they recently purchased a company called Fitness World in Denmark. If you don't know the gym cycles, gyms are very seasonal. You don't want to miss these peaks. This is known as the peak in the trade, and if you miss that in the January peak, everyone wants to go to the gym. They've eaten too much, drunk too much, get to the gym. That's their busiest time. That's where they make the most money. So what you ultimately do not want to do is miss that. Now, at the time, PureGym's development processes and things were entirely outsourced, and so they engaged with an external agency to build their website. And back in 2015, they had an outage during that peak. And it was a 2 or 3, maybe 4 day outage, which was far too unacceptable. And they felt that they needed to do something about it. So this Humphrey Cobbold, who was a CEO and still is a CEO at the time, got brought on board, very technology focused, and decided that he wanted to build an internal team. So Humphrey spoke to the next colleague of his, Dan Glide, who is the then CTO, and asked him to build an internal team. He then recruited someone called John Kilminster, which you may know locally, and this was all based in Southampton, the actual head office for PureGym is in Leeds, but we set up the IT team in Southampton because that's where Dan lived. He didn't want to move to Leeds. We then hired 4 people, and hence this is where we start from 4. There is John Kilminster, myself, a designer, Justin Amplet, and a tester, Edward. So what was the main goal? So the goal of what we needed to do as an internal team was re-platform the website. It was an already pre-built site. They had a bunch of functions, processes, and things that brought people onto the gym system. PureGym themselves are an entirely online business, so if the website goes down, it means they can't join people. They don't have people inside the gym signing you up. It's a budget gym, so they try to keep the costs down as much as possible. And so our goal was to move their existing site and create a brand new fancy. So we took a punt at the tech stack that we were going to focus on. At the time, we chose Umbraco as the CMS. We were using SpecFlow for our testing and behavior-driven development. We were using something called New Relic for monitoring, SolarWinds Logly for logging, React.net was the front-end JavaScript tool of choice, and we were entirely hosted in Azure. Now, 4 years ago, or back in 2015-16, some of these techs were really quite new, especially React. And I don't know if you remember Azure, if you ever got involved in there, but anyone remember the old Azure portal, which was a Silverlight wonderful beast. So there were some challenges around using that tech at the time. The reason we chose React.net was, again, at the time, although it was fairly bleeding edge, it was, you can kind of see here, a real kind of peak in the frequency and commits. It was the thing to be getting involved with if you were a JavaScript and .NET full stack developer. So moving on from that, after we kind of looked at that pipeline, we decided on a continuous integration pipeline that was going to be made up of Bitbucket, which is a source code repository tool. TeamCity was going to be used as our build tool. Octopus to actually do the deployments into production. And then for its sins, we chose Jira and Confluence as the tools of choice to manage our processes. Jira, everyone's got an opinion on Jira. You can use it as simply or as complicated as you like. We try to keep it simple. It still had its foibles, but we shall see. Confluence, we did find it was really good as a wiki tool and a documentation tool. I'd definitely recommend that side of things. From the environment kind of configuration, we were looking at alpha environments to do developer and system level testing. Beta was our kind of like-for-like production environment where we would run our tests to make sure that everything was going to be all good. Our most production-like environment, obviously our production environment, and then a Gamma environment was used to do load testing and anything where we needed to do investigations around whether the site was performant or things like that. From a disaster recovery perspective, we looked at Cloudflare and we were resilient across 2 regions. So we hosted in North and West Europe. with a kind of active and secondary failover. So mainly active in North Europe, but if the worst happened, we would fail over to West Europe. And essentially this was behind something called Cloudflare and Traffic Manager that managed that for us. So we kind of decided as like a foursome, these were the kind of the tech stacks and the things that we wanted to achieve. And so after that, we knew what we wanted to achieve. We had a fairly fixed product backlog as far as we could see. It was an existing website with existing features, just a case of lift and shift, right? We just want to take what we have now and move it across. We've got a fixed deadline, so we know it needs to be done by, I think it was the May of that year. So we needed to scale. We needed to get more people into the team, and grow to 16 was the number we plucked out of the air at the time. For anyone that hasn't seen it, I'm sure you guys have totally seen this one. But we wanted to follow an agile process. So this is Henrik Niebuhr's classic agile drawing, which sums up our process. So we don't want to deliver something in one big bang right to the end to try and make the customer happy. We want to actually deliver something that attempts to make them happy with the smallest possible feature set, get that feedback early, make improvements upon it, keep getting that feedback, smaller increments, etc., and keep improving it, keep improving. So that's the kind of approach that we wanted. We started to look at the actual requirements of the website. So basically, you want us to rebuild the website like for like, right? Yeah, of course, that's what we want. So you want us to recreate all of the bugs and the rubbish UX in the existing website. No, actually, maybe if you could maybe not introduce or that bit of the process that doesn't quite work, can we change that? So suddenly going from right, we've got a fixed backlog of exactly all the features that we thought we needed to develop and to deliver, it threw up the questions about actually, we don't want to rebuild the existing website. We need to kind of change it slightly, change the process, change the user experience, and deliver a better website. So we needed to start to better understand what it was actually needed. So we employed something known as story mapping, where we would go through a series of processes to identify who the actors were in the process, what activities they were trying to achieve, and what tasks they needed to do to make that happen as part of a join journey, or if the member was trying to freeze their account, those kind of things. And then we would come up with a series of those features across the board that would deliver value in increments. And features. Jaw-dropping sports stories. I do apologise. I just kicked off Siri on my phone. Shouldn't have said Siri. So yes, and then come up with a series of releases in which we wanted to incrementally deliver some workable software. So at any point in time, although we had a 6-month deadline, if the business said, right, we need to launch, then it needed to be ready, it needed to be moved across. So identifying the key kind of feature areas that needed to be done first, deliver those in sprints. So at the time, because of what we had was this known fixed backlog of things that we needed to get done, we had a deadline to deliver, and Scrum as a process is fairly well understood. It's got some good training wheels on there, and people can follow the process fairly straightforward. We decided to adopt the Scrum approach, doing 2-week sprints with planning and planning poker sessions and doing retrospectives and essentially all of the daily stand-up kind of processes that you would typically associate with the Scrum way of working. We had clearly defined ceremonies and again that well understood backlog that we needed to get done. So we had about 16 people and we decided to break into two pizza teams, but with one kind of clear shared goal. So essentially we broke the team into 2 core areas, acquisition, which was getting people into the sites of a join process and the gym process, and then the kind of retention area, which is like the members sort of things once you're inside the site, what kind of features and things do you need to use as a particular member. We were using, as I mentioned before, planning poker and story points. Again, most of the people in the team had worked with this process before and were aware of everything involved in coming up with story points in order to gain the velocity and therefore be able to track our progress and determine whether we were going to hit our deadline or not. So to use that, or to achieve that, we were then using burn down charts with a big backlog of all the features that we needed to get done, and we were tracking progress to make sure that at any particular point, or we could come up with some kind of forecast around whether we were going to hit that deadline. As I also mentioned before, we were doing demos and retros, so at the end of each 2 weeks, we would do a demo to the wider business, make sure that the things that we delivered were what they expected, gaining their feedback. Now, obviously, it was a transition of an existing website to a new one, so we couldn't actually ship to live at that particular point. It needed to be a big bang kind of transition from the actual website to the live one. So all of the deliverables at the end of the 2-week sprints would be going into the preview site that UAT and the business could kind of access and play around with and get some early adopter members to try it out and make sure it's looking okay. So we'd use our retros to get the whole team involved and basically try to improve how we were working as much as possible. From an architecture perspective, we decided explicitly to choose monolith because of the short deadline and the known backlog that we needed to get done. We were looking for simplicity over complexity, and the monolith way of working, the deliverable was much easier to manage as a whole, and that was the choice. I'll speak a bit later about some of the impacts of making that choice, but it was the right one, we felt, at the time. And from a software development process or a source code repository process, we followed something called Git flow, which just is for those that don't know, just a way of branching and creating different branches depending on what you wanted to work on and create a release for. So at the end of each sprint, you would create a release that would have a release candidate, a release branch. All of the features would be worked on individually. They would be merged into this develop branch, and then at the end of the sprint, if it was ready to be delivered, then we would merge it into master and ship. And it's a fairly well kind of adopted way of working in the world of software development. From a deployment frequency perspective, we were essentially shipping once every 2 weeks, not to production, as I say, to a preview environment, but that was the plan. And everyone was fairly comfortable with that at the time. So just to kind of recap where we'd come from. So we'd started with a team of 4. We scaled to 16. We'd chosen what we considered at the time a fairly modern tech stack with continuous integration set up. We had a prioritized backlog. We were using Scrum, planning poker and story points. We were working in 2-week sprints. We were doing demos for the business, doing retrospectives, and we were using GitFlow. So all good. All seemed fine and dandy. And
Hey,
sorry, yep.
is it okay to take a pause in 1 minute or so? It's just because you've set a really clear context, and it actually could be a great time just to break for a couple of minutes and ask for questions.
Yeah, sure. So just finishing on this one is basically, we hit our target. So at the end of that kind of period, following that process with that tech stack, we hit the deadline, we were on time to budget, and we convinced the wider business that having an internal tech team was the right way forward, and that justified more investment into the team going forward. So yeah, that's a reasonable time to break the questions.
Because I've been struggling to get people into the room. I might not have been paying perfect attention, but just to set the context, how many months or years are we talking out between the decision being made, actually we're going to have this new team to bring development in-house, to this target being hit? How long was that?
So the decision was, I was hired in October 2015, I think. And then we converted and transitioned the site by the end of May 2016.
So yeah, less than a year.
Yeah.
And you had smiley, happy faces.
Smiley, happy faces. Yeah, people were happy. It was all good.
Cool. So just to the crowd in the room, is there anything that you'd want to clarify or comment on so far?
Yeah, the planning poker and story points. Can you just go through that quick? I'm sorry to be a pain, but it seemed like an interesting point to me. And maybe something that a lot of us could learn from. Could you just go through that again for us? I'm very sorry if everybody else has.
So the main the main thing was that we needed to know whether we were going to hit our 6-month deadline. Essentially, we had what essentially was 12 weeks worth of work. If we could assign a story point sizing to the stories that we had, so using the whole kind of relative sizing. So if a particular story was a size 8, is this other story about the same size? Is it twice as big? Is it half as big? Getting a rough idea of how big each particular story was. And obviously it's all guesstimation, nothing set in stone, but based on our velocity then, if we were then to burn through 25 points worth of stories in each 2-week sprint, and the total backlog was 600 points, are we on target to hit a 6-month deadline, and using that burn down chart to track the progress, so that we can start to make decisions on, well, given the current backlog size, we're not going to hit that deadline. So what can we ship? What can we push beyond 6 months? Still deliver a working site? What's the essential? And start to have the conversation around what's the priority. Because based on what we currently have, we're not going to hit it. Okay.
It's quite interesting because obviously since you've done this, obviously the tools have changed immeasurably, haven't they?
Well, because we've had a sneak peek in the abstracts about where Rich is going to go next.
Right, I shall keep quiet.
I guess some of it's coming
Sorry.
up.
I'll keep quiet now. Sorry about that.
No, yeah, don't spoil the surprise, Rich. And anybody else just got anything to clarify or point out?
I have a question about the objectives, like business objective. You mentioned that the goal was to replace the website. What was kind of wrong with the old one? Was it not kind of performant enough or not maintainable?
Well, so the main driver was the 3-day outage, or that was the nail in the coffin. Was that They, as a business, they didn't have control over that website, and it was one of the key assets in that they're an entirely online gym. If the website's down, they're not making money.
Okay.
So people can't join the gym.
Was that the moment when the company realized that they're actually a software company, right?
Well, yeah, essentially.
Okay.
Yeah, or they wanted to focus on technology.
Makes sense. So it was very risky, basically.
Yeah.
So we've had a question in the text chat, which I'll just read out. Did you have to coach the management on your flow or your project management mantra, or were you able to just hop in and we trusted to get the requirements done and crack on with the job?
So as a wider team or as a wider business, they put a lot of trust in Dan and John and the team that we built. So essentially, we were given the remit to run the project. And we kind of, yes, we had to educate them on what we were doing, why we were doing it. The user story mapping was across the entire back wall of an office with big sticky notes. That,
so you were keeping things visible. You were not hiding.
Massively visible. Bring people in. Actually have a conversation around those tickets to make sure that they understand the enormity of what they're actually asking us to deliver.
Thanks, Pedro, for that question. And then the one that I would like to point out, perhaps related to what Pavel was talking about, is just when you said you had a fixed product backlog. And that statement, well, we just want you to replicate the old website. Okay, you don't need Agile, then you know what you're doing. Crack on.
Yeah.
So
until you then start asking questions. Do you really want that bit? Oh,
okay. No. Great. Okay, so sorry for the interruption. We'll go for another 15 or 20 minutes. Target hit, big party. Rich, back to you.
So it was happy days at that particular point. So to get to 16, the guys had hired a bunch of a mix of permies and contractors. So at this particular point, they pitched half of the team, scaled back to 8 as a kind of a working initiative, and it became kind of time to reflect. So it's like mad panic to get the 6-month project done, to deliver that, make sure we deliver it and make sure it's working, we get customers through the door, but we needed to then look back and see what we could have done better. So referring back to W. Edwards Deming, we should work on our process, not the outcome of our processes. We needed to look at whether the process was working for us, whether, although we'd hit the deadline and we were successful, was it actually really successful in our own minds? If you're not aware of Deming, then he's mainly widely acknowledged as a leader in management thinking in the field of quality, and he was a statistician who was mostly responsible for Japan's recovery after the Second World War, and was fairly key in Toyota's total production management process, total quality management, sorry, which is also known as lean manufacturing nowadays. So we needed to look at our own process for continuous improvement, and again, I'm leaning on Henrik Nieberg's diagrams here because he's produces some pretty cool ones. So essentially, we needed to decide what we wanted to achieve. We need to go out there, work out what's getting in our way, and we also then need to remove any of the biggest impediments. So if we're looking at what's out there, we've got a bit of a river. We need to keep on looking to see what's getting in the way, and there's a big old rock. How can we move that? How can we get that out of our way to improve our process and our efficiency as a team? So we were doing that and having a bit of a project retro. What went right and what didn't go quite so right. One of the key things for us was there were too many cooks. We hired high quality developers, kind of no expense spared guys, so all very experienced, all had good opinions or strong opinions on the way things should or shouldn't be done, which then actually ultimately resulted in a lot of churn and heated discussions about which way things should or shouldn't be done. And because everyone was of a certain level, there was no kind of clear architect at the time, or a lot of us in the kind of lead team are fairly humble in that we accept that a lot of people are going to be better than we are, and then didn't want to kind of squash any ideas and say it's going to be done this way. But that ultimately resulted in a lot of conversation, shall we say, and heated discussions around which particular processes to follow. We also had issues with our Git flow. We didn't really find that was working well for us. So firstly, the releases were performed by a QA engineer. So they were kind of a gatekeeper to our deploys being done, which meant that they automatically became a bit of a bottleneck in the process. We also found that the way we were working kind of encouraged these long-running feature branches, which ultimately led to challenges around merging features in. We spent a lot of time merging code together. And we also found that it was really well aligned to the sprint process, but because of that, again, we develop 2 weeks worth of work individually and then bring it all together in a big bang at the end of the sprint, which was all then released to production by this QA engineer, which wasn't really working well for us. So essentially what we had was this batch flow of process. We were getting things done following our Kanban process, adding things into this release. There was going to be the release at the end of the sprint, and then every 2 weeks we would deploy that into production. But we found that this, when we start to look back, this particular release or patch flow was causing us a bit of an issue. And some of the challenges were around kind of once you deployed 2 weeks worth of work into production and there was a problem, which particular part of that 2 weeks worth of work caused the problem. So not only was it merge help getting in there in the first place, but the time to actually discover what any particular bit of code or code change caused the problem was challenging as well. We also found that planning estimation became a little bit of a waste of time in some ways, in that having the 2 week forced deadline and the forced planning and the forced estimation introduced some kind of planning and estimation, or finishing off the sprint for the sake of finishing off the sprint, as opposed to the things ready to get done. So we were doing a lot of kind of tidying up and finishing up at the end of the sprint when we didn't necessarily really need to do that. We didn't feel we needed to do that. And then also the whole kind of process of story point estimation, getting into a room, trying to understand how big a particular story is. That all took a lot of time. And it was great for what we wanted to achieve in the 6 months. But going forward, was that a process that we still wanted to follow? So it was a bit of a time for change. It was time to look at those processes and make decisions on how we can improve it. So a reference to our first book, the DevOps Handbook. If you haven't read that one, it's a really interesting overview of how to do DevOps. but we were at the time what I now consider a devs doing ops. So we were developers who happened to manage Azure infrastructure. So we didn't have an ops team, but as a concept of what DevOps is as a whole process, we weren't doing that. We were definitely devs doing ops, not a DevOps organization. So for those that aren't aware, there are 3 ways of DevOps, 3 kind of core principles. The first way is systems thinking and flow. So how can we flow value from the business to our customer as quickly and as seamlessly as possible, in the most efficient way. The second way of DevOps is amplifying of feedback loops. How can we make the work visible and shorten the time it takes for us to take action on anything that needs to get done? And the third way is kind of encouraging the culture of continual experimentation and learning, and how can we encourage that within the organization to make sure that it's a safe place for people to be able to feedback and improve processes. And when you look at those 3 ways, it's very tied into Agile and a lot of the software development practices that we already do. So we're kind of comfortable in the whole feedback loops and continuous culture of continual experimentation, because we're kind of doing that and using our retros and this whole process of looking back at what we've done and improving our process was part of our culture anyway. So we wanted to improve the flow and our feedback loops. So instead of looking at the batch process of Scrum, how can we reduce the time it takes for us to deliver value to the customer? So instead of waiting to put the items into the big batch at the end of the 2 weeks, we decided that we would aim to deliver a single piece of functionality from development all the way into production. So how can we put the process of taking a feature for a particular developer, getting them to take that all the way through the process, and then they push the button to actually deliver that into production. So therefore removing the bottleneck around the QA from actually having to do that release process. But also it gives us the benefits of knowing that once that one particular feature ships into production, our rollback mechanisms, or our ability to say, there's a problem, what caused it? Well, it was that one feature. So the risk of doing batch delivery is far reduced, and our feedback loops are massively reduced too. So the way we achieved that within the Azure ecosystem, we used something called blue-green deploys, which essentially makes use of something on an app service, which is 2 deployment slots. You have your production slot, which is customer-facing, and that might be the blue slot. You would then deploy to our green slot, make sure everything was working as it should be, and then switch and swap the new code into production. What this meant was that as soon as there was a particular problem with that piece of code, and we know there was a problem because we used monitoring using New Relic and Loggly. And so our build and deployment process would look at those tools and say there's an increase or there's a spike in errors, which is abnormal. So to then roll back from that, we would just swap the slots back again. The customer knows none the wiser, and we've got time to go back and unpick the particular issue. And it's one commit that needs to be removed, as opposed to unpicking 2 weeks worth of work to try and work out what it was that actually caused the problem.
I'm going to get a little bit interrupted again. Sorry, Rich. I mean, that's massively significant, isn't it? The slide that you showed before, which is a picture of single piece flow. So you got everybody to commit to working on one thing together and then putting that thing very quickly, as fast as they can, into live and making sure that they've got a reliable rollback mechanism so that if it doesn't work in live, quickly pull it back, minimal harm done.
Yes, so we weren't truly single piece flow. So the developers would work on an individual feature, or maybe a pair of developers would work on a feature. So we might have a few things in flight, but any deployment, any single deployment was only ever one person at a time.
Right. So those long-lived branches that you felt in your retrospective were causing you pain, you've pushed down on those, but you've still got maybe one or two. Did you use branching? I mean,
So,
that's a technical
yes,
thing, isn't it? Yeah.
Absolutely, and I'll come on to that shortly.
Yeah. But the query I wanted to make then was that in your retro, you saw that you had too many voices, and there's a couple of decisions you've made, and the most important one is we decided we would concentrate on single piece flow. So how did you bring those many voices on the journey, or how did you squash those voices? I don't know what the right...
I mean, there was a lot of discussion around whether we should go that route or not, and the key, or the major push to that, was the reduction of risk. So the whole argument of taking 2 weeks worth of work and deploying that into production versus one piece of work and deploying into production, and the risk associated with that, the time to recover, all of those kind of nice metrics to track your progress were far more convincing on the single piece flow. But there were people that said, no, we should continue working this other way. And so we had to have those discussions. And as in our retro, we would say the outcomes or the actions from the retro are, let's try it. What does it involve? Who can we set up one small project team to work in that way? What do we need to get done to make that happen? And then how can we de-risk any issues involved in the transition?
Sorry, thanks, Rich.
No worries. So some of the other things that we introduced to help us with this process was something called feature flags. This particular slide is from a company called Launch Darkly. They offer a feature flag service. We didn't use this particular service, but it was a nice slide. So I grabbed it off the internet, off their website. But we actually built our own internal feature flag system. And the main driver for using the feature flags was it decoupled our deployment into production from our feature release. So it meant that we could continually deliver small pieces of code functionality behind the feature flag. And at the point that the business wanted to launch the feature, or when we wanted to test the feature for a small subset of customers, the way we split that up was on a per gym basis. So there would be some key gyms that would be good performers and some that are bad performers. And we would handpick certain gyms to be able to test different features to see whether how it performed against the existing site in a like-for-like gym environment. So the use of feature flags was a real kind of opened the door to making the small changes deliverable into production a fairly key feature. So what the other impact of this was that instead of our deployment frequency now being like once every 2 weeks, what it ultimately meant was, because our total from commit to running tests and deployment out into production took about an hour, it meant that we could ship 8 times a day. So essentially, theoretically, if a bug was raised in the morning, 8 a.m., and we could identify that bug, fix the bug, maybe that took 2 hours, we could get it shipped, prioritize it, make it pop it in the urgent lane, and deliver that into production within a day or within a couple of hours, depending on how long it took to fix the bug. And that was a real kind of, it freed us from being able to like, oh yeah, we'll fix that, but we can't do that until the 2-week sprint is over. So we'll, it'll be a hot fix, or we wouldn't have to do this instead of having to do a different process for hot fixes. It just was the process. So you just delivered bug fixes and hot feature changes in the same way, just one piece of code. And then that comes back to how that changed our branch strategy, because it just meant we just had master and features. We kept it being called features, but it could just branch 0 or whatever, really. Doesn't matter, but each particular ticket number had its own feature branch, which would be kept as small as possible, and we would deliver. And basically the deployment process would be merge into master. That triggers the continuous integration process, which ultimately then becomes continuous delivery. But we were still a little bit suspect at the time, so we put a little a manual step in the process, so that we would run like a payment check, make sure that you could pay with something through a credit card on the production site before you actually swapped it into production. And eventually, over time, we removed that and made it all automated. So we also try to encourage flow in our daily stand-ups. So because we're now walking single piece cards all the way through the board, anything on the right-hand side is the closest to production. So we walk the board from right to left, because this thing here is the closest to delivering value to the customer. And then we would walk the board to see what's left in final review, encourage developers to do those final reviews, again to make them ready for delivery into production. And then we also began to introduce work limits around how much work we have in progress, how many tickets we should have in flight at any particular time. They weren't hard and fast WIP limits, in that you could still add, you could break the limit, but it raised the question at the stand-up about, we've got too many things in test. Should we actually stop development and developers help the testers to get some testing done, or can we help doing automation tests or anything like that, and make sure that those things kind of move across the board. And then ultimately, kind of our last thing that we speak about is what's blocked, so that the last thing in people's minds is, right, we need to unblock this thing as they leave the stand-up. Now, one of the kind of real downsides of ramping up really quickly and delivering something within 6 months and scaling a team is that you ultimately end up with a bunch of tech debt. Tech debt is essentially all the craft that slows you down and makes the system harder to understand, or for developers to kind of reason about why things are the way they are. And then ultimately, the interest that you pay on that debt is the time and the extra effort that it takes you to make changes to the system. And over time, the things that we could develop really, really quickly early doors became a lot harder as the system grew. And so, one of the big...
So was it really tech debt? Did you intentionally take on debt because you wanted to release quickly, or was it just that you'd worked hard for 6 months and you'd learned a bunch of stuff?
I think inevitably, like when you're working to a fixed deadline, that you make decisions about how much quality and things you need to build in, or how much time you can spend getting things done. At that particular time, we had built tech debt, but also It's things like the debt of people not quite understanding how the code was put together, or the process, or the how the unit test should have been written. Things like that, where people make assumptions and then things get done not quite the right way.
Yeah, it's a minor quibble, but I often argue about tech debt. Debt is, something that you don't take on unknowingly, or at least you should make it very visible. Right. Anyway, I'm going to throw in the break time now, Rich, if that's okay with you.
Okay, that's cool.
So I suggest the way that we use this is we're going to go back into Rich's slide sequence in 15 minutes time. So that will be 20 to 8. But I'm not sure what to do here. I'm going to create some breakout rooms. And what we discovered last time we used the breakout rooms is that you can leave a breakout room, which will bring you back up into this session. So I'm going to create 2 breakout rooms, which essentially gives us 3 rooms that we can be in. And also you can just step away. So if you need to just stretch your legs for 15 minutes, feel free. So let's do that. I'm going to assign people randomly to 2 rooms. And Rich, are you happy to hang around here in this room? Okay, so the way I suggest this works is you're going to find yourself in a small group. You can take the opportunity to talk to each other, or if you've got a question for Rich, leave the breakout room using your Zoom controls, and we'll see you back in here, and Rich will take questions. Is that okay? Okay, so Rich, if you find yourself in a room, you have to leave, I'm afraid, so just say goodbye. And what we'll do at the very end of this session is we'll deliberately set up a structure where we can just have some smaller chats with each other as well for people who want to stay. Okay, so I hope nobody's going to leave, and here we go. The rooms are creating now. And the rooms are open. Okay, so it looks like people have to manually choose to join those breakout rooms. So if you want to have a conversation in a smaller group, head into the room. If you've got any questions for Rich, hang around here and shout out, unmute your microphone, use the chat. So Rich, I guess I've got a question, which is, I'll save my question. Come on, who else has got a question? Let's keep Rich busy. All right then, Rich. So too many cooks. You'd hired a lot of experienced developers. Mm-hmm. How did you go from that too many cooks situation to having people respecting WIP limits and single piece of
so this, when the team was 16, that's when it was that's when it was tough with the too many cooks. At the point we got to the 8, it was much more of a, so all the people with the heated or the strong opinions that didn't quite mesh well had left.
So that's the key thing, isn't it? That people, did you ask them to leave, or did people just think this isn't the place, the style of work that I want?
It was the contract, the contract element of it, because they were there on a contract. It was kind of, okay, well, we don't need that side of people. And let's form a team of 8 people that are pragmatic and happy to discuss the pros and cons of the process. But yeah, even to this day, actually, the ownership of architecture and how things is still a challenge. From a process perspective, it's all fine, but actually making clear kind of decisions on we should do it this way. It's still a very democratic way of working, but you end up maybe not being as quick as you could be because you're spending a lot of time justifying reasons for doing things in a certain way.
Yeah, so you're making it obvious what the problem that you're trying to solve is. You're not just asking people to change the way they work, the way that they work.
Yeah, exactly, and it's presenting that back in, well, we currently work this way, it's not working because of these reasons. We're suggesting doing it this way because of these reasons, and this solves that problem, this would solve that problem. What do you think? And then if, because in the retros we would then have voting on particular tickets, everyone as a team would agree that, okay, well, the next 2 weeks, let's give that a try and see how it flies.
And that's another key thing, isn't it? It's saying this is an experiment. Can we try this? And if we see a positive effect, then we can choose to keep doing it.
Yeah. And it's about creating that safe environment, that safe culture where people can challenge an idea and say, this isn't working, and not be shot down in flames because they spoke out and said, it's not working for me. And we would challenge it back and say, well, why is it not? Or what's your proposed? You can't just say, it's rubbish, it doesn't work. It's rubbish, it doesn't work, and this is the suggestion for what we could do to make things different.
I want to say something really cynical and contentious, but I feel bad doing it.
Yeah, go on, do.
But you talked about the too many cooks and these talented contractors that you were working with, and it's often these people who say, oh yeah, no, I've been in the hierarchy and I've played the politics. I just want to get back to being developers. And then often you find that those people are the most frustrated people in that development role, don't they? Because they want to tell everyone how everyone else should be working. Anyway.
It's true.
However, I mean, the approach that you took there, which is highlighting the problem, look, here's the problem that we need to solve. I suppose there are often more than one solutions to any problem on the face of it, aren't there? So yeah, then you can get into tricky situations. Yeah. But yeah, you normally try and avoid hierarchy. Yeah, cool. So just a mic check. Can everyone else speak? Ian? No, your sound's not working.
Mic's not working. I might go and just grab a beer.
Yeah, do that. I'm sorry I can't bring you one.
That's right.
You're 40 miles away. Hey, Ian, thanks for joining us. Sorry I left you out in the lobby for too long. And I still can't hear you. Can anyone else use their microphone? Dave?
Does mine work now?
Oh, yes, it does. Hi, Ian.
Great, okay. No, I was only out for a few seconds. No problem at all.
Cool stuff.
So I've heard this before, but I had to leave before the end. So it's this, and it was getting good at the end.
It gets good at the end. Well, I've enjoyed the beginning as well. I mean, it's a great mix of organisation, behaviour, and technology. I don't know, how do other people feel about that? A bit of breath on your microphone there, Rosaline. Yeah, that's probably better.
I was going to ask Rich what examples of the most recent experiments, like last week and the week before. That as we look back several years, there'll be lots of great big ones. But I was wondering about just like the most recent one as an example.
Is that a good one for right at the end of the session, I suppose, when we've gone through the whole journey? Yeah, good one.
Yep.
I'm really interested in the behaviour here. So I can see Dave and Jose and Pedro, I'm guessing, have all stepped away from their computer just to enjoy the break. But feel free to shout and say, no, I'm still here. And so Ian, because you did miss the beginning of this session, it's all being recorded. Rich reminded us to hit record right at the very beginning of the session, so you can catch up if you want. And then we've got these two breakout rooms, which are a really interesting experiment, and people have disappeared into them. And I suppose we could dip in and see what people are talking about.
Spy.
You don't have to keep me company. I'm happy to.
Not at all. Well, what I'm saying is, I don't mind if you want to go in. It's slightly annoying. So what I would love in Zoom is if we had the ability to choose either. Well, I can because it's my meeting. Oh, hi, Dave. Oh, he's gone. Yeah, we can't hear you. You muted. Dave said, I'm not talking to you anymore. You smell. I hate you and everything you stand for. All that Scrum stuff. It's really wound me up. It's really microphone not working, I guess, is what you're trying to say, Dave. Yeah. What you were calling batch flow, you can almost call Scrum flow as well, can't you? You're just resisting the opportunity to have a little poke at Scrum with that, Rich.
So you can do Scrum and still do single.
Yeah, that's absolutely true, isn't it? Because Scrum is saying
there's nothing that mandates that you need to ship at the end of the 2 weeks.
Oh, very wise. But often it is a pattern that people fall into.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So yeah, And also a lot of people don't realise that Kanban has a lot of ceremonies in it as well, and cadences. And
yeah, so the Kanban has the Kanban cadences. I guess that's the Kanban method, or you can say you're using a Kanban system to support your metrics. It's really strange. Every now and again, I say something that supports Scrum because, like you, there's nothing in Scrum that says you can't do continuous deployment. But defending Scrum can just be so painful sometimes. But it's not worth attacking it either.
No, I mean, there are times and places where I think it actually works, and especially if you've got a new team, new people that are new-ish to Agile and don't really get it, then it's very good at bringing people up to speed in the general principles.
Yeah.
Maybe not the story points and planning.
Yeah.
That's not Scrum mandated either.
So I can only assume, Rich, that the kids outside have just stolen a new moped, and they're just razzing it for all it's worth before the police come to get them. Or your neighbour has got a brand new petrol mower and he's doing the garden.
No, it's things gone really loud.
Or
maybe it's an audio compression issue. It's like you're paying the pan pipes when you're speaking. Oh, when you listen to the recording, you'll hear it.
Maybe it's the fan. Maybe Rich is sitting in his server room.
That's weird.
Yeah, watch the back of the recording. This bit will be great. Right, so something else that I don't understand is we're recording this meeting. I assume it's our wise words that are being recorded, but maybe we're recording the breakout rooms as well. We'll find out. Every day's a learning day.
I think it does. I think it gives you recordings of all the rooms.
It's really interesting. Dave Mace was not assigned to any room either, so Dave remained unassigned.
Just try plugging my mic into a different USB.
I left the room in a break.
It's an audio. It sounds like real words, so you're not turning into a robot or anything. It just sounds like when Zoom realizes that you're speaking, it's opening up the mic, and it sounds like it's picking up a motorbike. But
like a crescendo.
I wonder if.
But it's also not something I noticed during the presentation. So maybe it's just that since the three of us started talking more conversationally. Dave thinks he's fixed his microphone. Oh, let's
can you hear that?
No.
Okay. I wonder if
you're not using that microphone. This one. Oh, classic. Hey, Dave.
Yeah. Hi. Thank you for being back in.
Yes, and we can hear you. Yes.
Yeah. Thanks. I really appreciate what you said before. One question I want to ask you is, as a general point, is how did you do a lot of test-driven development as well? So were your deliveries all backed with automated testing going on? And also, did you have any intermediate environment, or did you go straight to production every time? And with that, did you have monitoring all the way through your process?
Yeah, all of the above, basically. So we had from day one, it was test driven or behavior driven with unit tests as well. So kind of following the automation triangle, looking to get more unit tests than we have, integration tests, more integration than UI tests, and more UI tests than manual, reduce manual tests to as small amount as possible. And so that we needed to trust that testing, so that when it was green, it meant the code was going to be green in production. And then if for whatever reason there was an issue in production, we had to roll back, then we would look to reproduce that issue in a test to make sure that next time we didn't regress. Okay, so you didn't have any QA step or stage at all? No, so there was definitely QA steps in between. So I don't know if you recall the alpha environment. So we had alpha environments, which were kind of the QA test environments. So the typical process would be that the developer would develop, they would then make it ready for test. So that would involve a pair review between the two developers to make sure the code looks good and the test coverage was there. The tester would then do some manual testing, deploy to an environment, make sure that there's some tests there, but also write some automation tests to cover the kind of higher level scenarios. And then when that was ready, then we were good to ship into production. We also had this Gamma environment, which if there was a particular performance issue or any investigation that we needed to do outside of that environment, we would do on there. Initially, we manually created each of those environments, but towards the end, we had developed an alpha on demand setup where the testers could just click a button and the environment would be created, deploy to it, and then tear it down again in order to kind of save costs.
Did you get to a point where you were able to deploy the entire environment at the same time as you did the release?
We didn't build an entire environment and then ship, and then didn't do the whole environment swap. It was only ever individual parts of the environment that we deployed to.
Right. Thank you. Thank you. Sounds like you did very well.
It was okay. It was definitely the most enjoyable development space I've worked in before.
Great.
Because of the practices that we followed.
Now I've closed the breakout rooms. Interestingly, the people in breakout room 2 rushed back in, but the people in breakout room 1 have not come back to join us. So their breakout room is just going to disappear around them and they'll be forced back in. It's interesting. I wonder what they were talking about. We'll ask them. So hey, welcome back everyone. People in breakout room 1, that was people with Josh and Peter and Graham and Kerry. You were having an interesting conversation because nobody rushed back. You all waited until you got forced back in. What were you talking about?
Josh was making some good recommendations for certain books to help Graham. Cool.
Okay. I feel like, is there anything you want to share with the class? But no, that's fine. If it was a helpful conversation for you, that's great. I just give everyone just while we're all back a chance to just make any point or clarify something with Rich. So we'll just kind of time box that to 2 more minutes, and then Rich, back to your slides. Back to you. Back to your story.
Back to the story.
Okay.
So how tied to 8:30 are you? Because we are slipping, so I can skip a few. I'm conscious that Ian's on the call and he saw the last presentation and he missed the end. So I want to deliver the end for Ian.
There is no hard stop because we're in a virtual building. We're not going to get kicked out, and there is no tidying up for me to do at the end of the session. So it's all very relaxed. Obviously, you don't want to keep us up too late, but
no,
yeah,
exactly.
It's all my fault. So my apologies for the interruptions.
I warned you.
I'll stop if you tell me to, but otherwise I'll carry on. Right. Okay, Rich, back to you.
Cool. Welcome back, everyone. Hope you enjoyed the break. Okay, so catching up where we were. So some of the tech debt that we encountered was, as I mentioned before, Dave, about our unit test process. So we used SpecFlow and BDD to implement our process. And when we scaled to 16, a lot of people didn't quite get how we wanted to organize the SpecFlow tests. It's subtly different to the way that we would do normal test-driven development. And so one of the issues that kind of came out of that and the tech that came up was that people implemented SpecFlow tests in the same way they would do the normal test-driven development tests, and that resulted in some confusion. So we had to spend a bit of time coming up with a way of working, and we came up with this kind of diagram, which we were able to explain to new onboarders how that would work. Some of the other things that they did as a team was they're very keen to introduce this concept of 20% innovation time. So Fridays where every single developer could work on what they wanted to work on, whether it be improving processes, introducing new concepts, trying to come up with a new feature or function for the customers. It could be anything. Some of the things that kind of came out of that development was one of the things was called DevBot, which is a little chatbot that some of the devs created, where if we needed some test data, test members, we would just say, DevBot, create me a member, that started in May 2019 on standard package 5 or whatever, and it would go off and do that kind of work for us. And that was a really useful tool that ultimately helped the testers and the team to be more efficient. He did all sorts, including things like finding out what IDs gyms were and things like that. We also, in that time, developed, excuse me, something called Deployment Monitor, which was up on some of the big TVs. We wanted to make our delivery process visible, so we built this process to combine the code being committed, the builds being done, the Octopus flow being delivered into production, and we also kind of gave her, as it became, we called her Holly, and she spoke to us. So essentially, we could commit code, carry on doing something else, and then when the code was ready to deploy, it would shout out a warning across the TV saying, Richard, your manual intervention is required for feature PG 4763. And she would sit there and say, come and push the button. You'd go along, push the button. And then when it actually shipped to production, she'd give you a pat on the back and say, good job, man, or she doesn't like the color, that kind of thing. So that was a bit of fun that we played around with. Some other things were monitoring. So we are quite keen on making sure we had monitoring all the way through the system. One of the devs came up with a monitoring system that monitored the traffic between us and our third-party membership management supplier. And this is an example of one of the graphs that came out, which kind of highlights when their system went down. It kind of goes off in this big kind of flurry of color. And again, that was on another big TV, so we can immediately see there was an issue with their system. We would jump on the call, give them a phone or send them an email and say, your system's down. They would say, no, it's not. And we would say, yes, it is, because we're tracking our traffic and it's these particular calls. And they would look into it and they'd say, yes, it is us, and one of our nodes is down. And so that kind of monitoring became really, really useful. And it was an output of the innovation time that we're able to do that, became invaluable. As far as kind of sharing knowledge across the team, we would introduce this concept of tech showcases. So every couple of weeks, if there was a key topic area, we would share the knowledge, record the sessions. People could come back, new starters could look at those sessions and see what was discussed. So how did we typically work with the 8 people? We had 4 kind of key areas. We had projects, anything that was more than 4 weeks worth of work. It was a bit more formal, so we should have a kickoff and a project retrospective at the end. There were small changes, so all those little things that were less than a week's worth of work, any particular bugs that were in production, and then this concept of GSD, getting things done, which was infrastructure monitoring and any kind of upgrading of packages, things that we just needed to get done as a team. Typically, so we started off trying to do 1 person per project team, so have 5 kind of streams, as it were. We quickly found that that kind of reduced quality and introduced siloed knowledge, especially in the project side of things. So we mandated that we should have a minimum of 2 devs on any particular project, and there should be a kickoff. But we would also have just 1 person dedicated to small change bugs and GSD. So if the project was 3 months, then 1 person would be on small changes for 3 months, 1 for bugs, 1 for GSD. And that basic kind of BAU work. If we needed to get more work done, then we needed more project teams, so therefore we needed to hire more people, and so we would add more people to these particular project teams, but keep the streams with these single silos or single people on them. Then this kind of project some of the feedback that we were getting from the projects were that things weren't quite right. So at the time we were starting to see a lack of business engagement. We had the cross-team collaboration as far as across the company was a little bit lacking. There were different goals between the marketing team, development team, commercial finance, and what we built wasn't necessarily what was required in some of these instances. So there was kind of starting to introduce some disparity amongst the team as we kind of settled into the process a bit more. So we wanted to look at how can we increase business engagement, that cross-team collaboration, and start to share goals a bit better, trying to maybe build the right thing. So we turned to some lean startup principles, like how can we maybe introduce some of these concepts to the wider business beyond us as a development team. So we would start to kind of talk to our marketing team, and one of the projects they wanted to do was increase our conversion rate. So how can we improve the conversion of by 5%? How can we increase the uptake of this extra product, which is like PureGym's premium offering? They were the kind of the goals the marketing team wanted to drive towards, but we didn't. The projects, or beyond the projects, they weren't necessarily driven by those kind of goals at the time. So based on those goals at the we weren't really kind of being given this is what we want to achieve in this period of time. So we decided to define this concept of a 90-day goal, and focus on one goal at a time. So how can we improve that conversion by 5%, and how can we make sure we're building the right thing? So again, leaning on the lean startup principles, we would look to do some experiments, and how can we introduce those experiments outside of the tech team, actually get the marketing team to run those in a bit more of a rigid process. So there's various different types of experiments. We've got the kind of qualitative items like customer interviews or high fidelity demos, which are cheaper but don't necessarily give you high metric based information, or you could do A/B tests and landing page stuff where we can start to get metrics on how things were working. So we wanted to introduce some of the concepts to the wider business and the marketing team, and we weren't really doing side-by-side discovery and delivery. So at the time, everything was just coming through the pipeline as projects. So actually, how can we do more discovery by doing lighter weight stuff to experiment with, get that in front of a customer, get some feedback as to whether it's the right thing to build or not. And so we, this one particular project, we worked with the marketing team and commercial finance to kind of iterate the join process to make sure that we didn't break the existing join process, but incrementally add and change parts of that process to move us or shift the needle towards increasing conversion. And for this particular process is where we didn't go to Scrum, but we introduced 3-week time boxes where we'd kind of go through this build, measure, learn loop. So the marketing team would come up with an idea of, we think that introducing a search function in the select your gym area will increase the percentage of people moving from step 1 to step 2 in the join funnel. We would then build out that functionality, ship it into production with a feature switch capable of presenting one version or the other, run that experiment for a period of time, measure the results, and then feed that back into developing the next item. So to then track that, we introduced to the marketing team their own CRO board, their own Kanban board, and these tickets that represented the experiments. So we gave them this kind of build, measure, learn board where they would create an experiment ticket. Luckily, they were really open to the process and open to using this concept of a hypothesis to come up with some known metrics. The person in charge of acquisition in the marketing team was very metrics driven, so I kind of love this particular process, and we worked to deliver this process for them, where we would define the experiment. This would then link off to the actual development board where we would do the work to either implement the experiment, or if the experiment was validated, we would then actually deliver the production version of the code. So remove the feature switch and actually implement the real thing. And the key thing here was that we had this kind of cross-functional team flow. So we had marketing, development, commercial, finance, and user experience all kind of coming together every kind of 3 weeks to have those kind of discussions around how the experiments went, whether they were viable and whether we should move forward with them. We would make decisions on whether they were validated or not, and then either feed them into the development flow or bin them off because they didn't work. And then we'd kind of work out what the next problems to solve was. Ultimately, that kind of resulted in, it was really good. The marketing team adopted the process. They rolled that process out amongst the other parts of the digital marketing team. So when they're running social media campaigns or anything like that, they would use the A/B testing type process and running the experiment process. But unfortunately, beyond the wider team, or beyond that particular team, the wider team was still happy in their kind of project world, and not really caring, kind of being very hippo driven. This is what we need to build because. And so we didn't get adoption across the board for the kind of experiment driven stuff initially. Cool. So moving on to the next section. If you haven't read this book, Making Work Visible, highly recommended. But some key takeaways from that book are that there's 5 time thieves, 5 things that will steal your time without either you knowing, or if you look hard enough, you can find them. And they are unplanned work. Anything that's unplanned can interrupt you and slow you down. Neglected work or tech debt. If you let things fester, it will start to slow you down. Unknown dependencies. You start a project, you don't realize there's a dependency on another team, or another product, another something or other. That will start to hurt. Conflicting priorities. You've got 2 stakeholders, and one wants one wants the other. And the big one, too much work in progress, just spinning plates and never actually getting stuff done. So how this kind of making work visible relates is that we wanted to do something about our small change bugs and GSD process, because the silos weren't kind of working well for the team. They were kind of, because you were working on a particular backlog for a long period of time, you became a bit demoralized. We were small changes and bugs, constantly context switching between different areas of the code. When the project teams finished stuff off, they would hand that over to the individual at the time, and also because each of the individuals had their own priorities, they weren't really interested in helping anybody else because that was their own prioritized backlog. So that wasn't really working too well. So we started to look at, well, actually, could we consolidate that team and make it a single, what we called a delivery team, where we take small change bugs and this GSD concept all into one team that can collaborate and have a more structured process around those particular things. But fairly quickly, it became apparent that the small change and bugs were kind of very much business focused, GSD not so much. And so the meetings that we were having with the business, they just weren't interested in the GSD side of things. So we kind of separated that out, had our GSD infrastructure type team and our delivery team with a shared UX resource in the middle. And so the overall kind of team structure that we had at this particular point in time, it has evolved again since then, which we'll come on to. But essentially, we'd have multiple project teams, and then after each of the projects were finished, they would kind of hand over to this delivery team or BAU team, and the small change team, or they would take on these tickets that were kind of between 2 and 4 days. So a project was anything greater than 4 weeks. Small changes were anything kind of less than a week. And that kind of was the way it worked. And we had our GSD team hanging in there as well. But of course, as with anything, the devil's in the detail. So our delivery team of all these small items that should be 2 to 4 days, inevitably turns out that everyone in the business wants things done. So there's not enough resource to get a project signed off. So what's the best way to get something delivered? Well, let's sneak it into the backlog. It's a 2 to 4 day item. And it turned out that this 2 to 4 day item called the class page redesign actually turned out to be about 6 weeks worth of work. They had already engaged with external agencies. They'd done full design documents of how it needed to be changed and implemented, and it had to be done. It was because they'd spent the time doing that. But it was one of those things that as a development team, we were just completely unaware of it until it kind of arrived at our backlog at the point where we opened the ticket and it was like, whoa, this is bigger than 2 to 4 days. What's going on here? And how did we miss it? Well, basically, it just wasn't visible. It was hidden in our backlog. We weren't aware of what was going on and what was happening in the wider business. We were focused on delivering the projects, and anything beyond that was challenging. We didn't have the processes in place to have to make it visible to the rest of the team. So we took a look at our Kanban board and said, well, what's missing? How can we make this? How can we make it the changes to make it more visible about this kind of work that's happening across the business? So when we look back at our side-by-side discovery and delivery, we weren't really tracking the discovery work. It was all happening in the wider business, but it would always come to us and arrive to us late in the day. So what can we do to make that more visible? Well, we introduce a discovery column. So the particular bit of work would go into discovery in our kind of planning discussions or planning meetings. Within a period of time, there would be some discovery work to be done. It's not development work, but it's kind of uncovering or understanding how big something is, giving that feedback to the business so that they can then make decisions on whether we should do it or not. But that threw up its own challenges. So how do we actually prioritize the work in that column? Like, what should we do next? So our next kind of experiment was to try introducing something called GIST planning. So GIST is a concept developed by Itamar Gilad, who's an ex-Google Google Product Manager. Maybe some of you guys have heard of him, but we thought we'd give this a go. So the basic gist planning concept is, the company's got goals that they set on a yearly basis. There's a number of ideas that would move the business towards delivering on those goals. In order to deliver those ideas, there'll be a series of little step projects that contribute moving towards making those ideas happen, and kind of the daily tasks. And essentially, we currently track the daily tasks. So our Kanban board was that tracking board. That's the stuff that we're doing to get things done. But we weren't really, it didn't have this, it wasn't visible that these ideas and step projects were kind of happening in a wider context. So we looked to say, how can we utilize our tooling to make it more visible? And we introduced this concept of an idea board. So this is kind of a higher level concept. So it's something that we think could contribute to our overall goals as a business, and would lead on to some development work. But it meant that we could then start to have discussions around those ideas earlier in the process. And we came up with a process which I'll talk about shortly in a moment. But in order to prioritize these, we looked to try to implement something called an ICE score, which is a combination of taking the impact of the idea, its confidence, how confident we are that it would achieve that impact, and then how easy it would be to get done. So using some simple numbers, we could take numbers 1 to 10. It's going to have a huge impact. It's going to move us towards delivering that particular goal. So that's a 10, or it's a low impact, give it a 1. How easy is it to implement? It's less than a week. It's a 10, nice and small. But anything much bigger than that, over a year, then it's a 1. But the big kind of game changer here is the confidence kind of numbers, which is a weighted number. So if the CEO comes in with an idea and it's just his own self-conviction, then we give it a weighting of 0.01. And obviously that has a bit of a multiplying effect and reduces the overall number I score. But if we've got some user evidence, or we've done some interviews, or we've done some kind of metrics to back up our idea, then we can up that number. And that's where our kind of step projects might come in. So you might do a step project to do some evidence gathering, or do some interviewing, or do some A/B testing to validate whether the idea was worth moving forward. So what does that kind of look like? Well, if you had an idea that live chat would reduce calls to member services by X amount, then it might be anecdotal evidence initially. So it might have a nice score of 20, whereas improving the members dashboard would reduce calls to member services. So trying to achieve the same thing, but we've got user evidence that supports that would be the case. So it would have a higher I score. We would then link between those two boards. So essentially the idea board and our delivery board, using Jira links, and we can start to have discussions around what needed to be discovered in our kind of process. So in any given week, we started to run kind of weekly increments, and we would take on some discovery tasks where we might do some estimation or deeper diving into what the idea is, and that gave us the kind of visibility of what potentially is coming our way, and then anything that was actually being delivered is still in development work. So then our delivery team, so because we'd now taken 3 streams and became one team, it allowed us to create our own process that focused around this concept of 3 weeks. So we built on the idea from the CRO sprints, taking this 3-week idea, have a wider idea prioritization session where more than one department stakeholder would come to that meeting. They bring their ideas that were prioritized, have discussions about what we should do next, and then we would take a particular stakeholder for a period of time. So we might say, okay, for the next 3 weeks, 9 weeks, 6 weeks, you're the key stakeholder. Bring your goals to the table, bring your ideas that will move you towards those goals to the table, and we will work with you to just do some discovery and also delivery to inch you towards your goals. When that allotted time was up, we would move on, change stakeholder, but that would then be a business decision about, well, should we focus on acquisition? No, because we've got some great ideas we want to implement in retention, so let's give them a bit of time. And it worked okay. It started to engage the business a bit more outside of the projects, and allow them to kind of have this discussion. One of the biggest challenges was actually having cross-department discussions about what was happening in the business, and making that work visible on the board gave us a kind of central point to have that discussion. But unfortunately, again, adoption across the wider organization or the wider project teams didn't quite take off, because it became known as the delivery team process, as opposed to it could be applied, or a similar approach could be applied to the project teams. So some other books that are well worth taking a look at if you haven't read them already. The Goal by Ilya M. Goldratt, really good. If you could skip that one and just read the Phoenix Project, which essentially is a rehash of the Goal, but in tech terms. But Goldratt introduced the concept of theory of constraints, which we will touch on shortly. I've already mentioned the DevOps Handbook, and then Accelerate, which introduces some interesting some metrics. So we'll just briefly discuss those. So we've got a team structure that kind of looks like this at the moment. We've got project teams that hand over to this delivery team that has various different stakeholders, retention, member services, all coming to this delivery team, having this kind of process that they go through. And the big kind of thing came in, right, we need to focus on mobile. Go. The commercial finance team essentially got the hippo status. We need to hire mobile developers. So double the team as fast as possible was the mandate. We obviously said, whoa, what do you mean just hire mobile developers? Have you not heard of the theory of constraints? If you haven't, then in simplest terms, there's one weak link in your inner chain, and if you pull on that chain, it's going to break there. Just saying go hire mobile developers was a bit of a challenge, because how do we know that the process that we currently have that works for 8 people with 8 deploys a day is going to work when we've got double the size of the team? Well, we don't. And what we need to do is understand what our current bottleneck is, and whether we would actually be able to support, or our current process could support bringing on that many mobile developers, and actually is it mobile developers that we need? So we felt that at the time, our deployment frequency was a bit of a challenge. Is 8 deploys a day enough? Ultimately, if we can't get things out the door, because we're doing the single piece flow, then it's just going to pile up in the ready to deploy column, and that just becomes the next bottleneck. So hiring more developers just to sit things in a list isn't going to work. So coming on to the Accelerate book, as it brings some key metrics. One of those is number of deploys per day, which suggests that if you're a high-performing team, then every developer that you add to your team, it should be not exponential, but a significant increase in the number of deploys that you can achieve, and therefore more value that you can add. Typically, medium performers can maintain their existing throughput, and low performers, as you add more people, everything just slows down, and actually you end up reducing your ability to deliver value. So there are some other key metrics that we wanted to kind of focus on as well. So understanding that, look, if you're going to bring in more people, what impact is that going to have on our deployment frequency, how long it's going to take us to deliver changes to the customer, our mean time to recover, which is kind of our ability to roll back from any given change if there's a particular issue, and then how many failures are we getting every time we deploy something into production. And we didn't really have a handle on what those kind of metrics were. So we kind of pushed back and said, look, don't just grow mobile. We need to look at understanding our capacity. So actually, let's invest in our GSD team, the people that are looking at our infrastructure and our monitoring and our capability, give them a bit more resource to better understand how we can improve our throughput. So we kind of set the goal for those guys and said, look, how can we double our throughput capacity? Because we think 16 deploys a day would work for us. So if our current deploy time took an hour, how can we reduce that down to 30 minutes? And with that kind of throughput, we could do that. We felt we're kind of comfortable with that. So we kind of set the GSD team off on a similar process where they would have a goal of doubling throughput, and then a series of GSD ideas that would move them towards making that goal happen. They would try things out and shift that number down to increase that throughput. And then once we got on top of that, we decided to scale to 40. And Steve's about to jump in with another question.
No, I'm choosing not to, but I've got it saved on the sticky pieces of paper over your monitor.
Cool. So the big thing for us at the time, it was great that we could look to improve our throughput by reducing our delivery time. But the big elephant in the room was that we still had a monolith at the end of the day. We hadn't re-architected, hadn't changed anything to make that happen. And obviously, the better way to increase your number of deploys per developer per day would be to deploy independent services rather than a big monolith each time. So we started to have kind of these architectural discussions around how could we start to move from our monolith to microservices to give us that capacity and the autonomy between teams, and start to reduce the coupling that we had between our teams. We had those kind of discussions, and again involved everyone across the development team to come to the table with what architecture should we go with. And ultimately the answer was we need to improve our process of improving as opposed to changing the architecture. So we need to address the issues that we have and then make decisions at the right time. So we started to look at each of the individual projects that were then coming in and making decisions around what architectural changes could we introduce in this project that moves us towards a microservice-based setup. Like microservices are highly coined term all over the place, but ultimately smaller services that could be deployed independently and developed and worked on separately. So there was an online cancel project which we looked to address, and we took the basic goal was to do it like an online cancel process similar to you would get with Audible. So it's actually a bit kind of more intelligent. If you cancel because you're moving home, then we would present you with did you know there was a gym just around the corner from your new destination, that kind of thing. So we look to introduce new technologies as part of this microservice, and we started to de-risk what would be involved in making that happen and start to break down the monolith. But again, it was part of this project flow, which became a challenge, because what inevitably happened was that the project stopped. And so all of that kind of architecture work, we couldn't commit to a longer term architectural roadmap because the project wasn't long lived or lived long enough for us to do anything about it. So that kind of begged the question, well, is project structure right for the architecture? And that leads me on to, I think, the final set of books recommendations, if you haven't read these, which is Scaling Lean, Thinking in Systems, Team Topologies, and From Project to Product. We'll probably do a book list at the end, but we'll come across how or why I recommend these books in here. So how can we change the team structure? How do we move away from short-term project teams to longer-term product teams in order to give us this kind of longer-term architectural shift from a monolith to microservices? And the decision or the thinking around or the output of the architecture discussions was that core part of that was the GSD, or the internal development team that makes these projects happen. So could our GSD team be more involved in the project structure to help guide architecture? And we went with that for a little while, but it didn't quite work out, in that we wanted GSD to have as much of a stakeholder in a project as business stakeholders, but it never quite worked out that way. But if we go back to the first way of DevOps, that first way is about systems thinking and flow. And I'd recommend the book Thinking in Systems, because it really breaks down the concept of what a system is and how you can mentally process it in your head. I did an internal presentation at PureGym called, based off the back of this book, called PureGym is a Bathtub. And the reason for that is that, well, ultimately a bathtub is a simple example of a system. You have water that flows into that bathtub, you have water that flows out, and you have a stock of water. If we had a feedback loop into our system, as the water flows out, we can adjust the input level. So we can make sure that any water that comes out, we can refill our bathtub and keep a constant stock of water. And so using that real simple concept of what a basic system is, we can start to kind of apply that to the business and its constituent parts. So bathtub is a system, and it's made up of these inputs, stock, and outputs. There's these feedback loops to help the system adapt to change, that are reinforcing and stabilizing. They can help us to identify bottlenecks, and they help us to kind of visualize any work in progress. And the feedback loops can also help us to encourage those kind of conversations. And if we have the conversations, it means we can collaborate more. So therefore, if a bathtub is a system, then equally PureGym is a bathtub. And if we start to look at PureGym as a system, and we look at taking from scaling lean this concept of a customer factory, the metric system here, if you've heard of Dave McClure's Pirate metrics, activation, retention, revenue, and referral, often referred to as Pirate metrics, because they are, anyway, hopefully someone's chuckling at that. But typically they're presented as a funnel. Scaling lean and running lean, they present this concept as this factory, so or as a bigger system. So when we're looking at the system of PureGym and applying the theory of constraints, if we're not activating people inside of PureGym, there's no point in throwing more people at PureGym. So the bottleneck could be activation. If we're not retaining people for longer, again, there's no point driving people into that system. So our constraint may well be in the retention area. So looking at PureGym as a wider system, how can we start to optimize that system for flow across the whole business? And so we start to push back and say, is project-based work the right approach to make that flow happen? And we kind of started to look at this project to product booked, moving from short-lived project teams to longer-term product teams that kind of stay and own a particular area of code for longer. And we were having those conversations a lot internally, but nobody really paid much attention to it until this particular book came out, Team Topologies, and it really kind of reinforced a lot of the concepts that we were trying to push, and the reasoning behind why you would want to organize your team in that way. Some of the core messages or takeaways from this particular book are there's this concept of Conway's Law, which ultimately says that your software or your system will be an outcome of how you organize your system or your company. So how your teams communicate within your company ultimately will have an effect on how you deliver software in various different ways. And a lot of companies that have got their head around that actually apply this thing called the reverse Conway maneuver, where you say, well, if that's always true, or near as damn it always true, how can we actually organize our team in order to deliver the software or the architecture that we want? So we can start to look at the team, this concept of team first delivery. What's the long running product team or value streams, as we'll streamline teams that we'll see shortly. And again, referring back to accelerate. So organizations should evolve their team and organizational structure in order to achieve the desired architecture. So it's starting to put a bit more of a planning about actually, rather than just throwing more project teams and increasing capacity by making more projects, how can we actually organize the team to be more longer lived? Because the concept of projects into this delivery team isn't ultimately optimized for flow, and the BAU team becomes overwhelmed. There's lots and lots of context switching. It's slow. Short-lived teams means you don't get optimal teams working together. Whereas if we're looking more to optimize for flow of change, and we have this concept of streamlined teams, so a particular team that's aligned to something within the business that delivers value end to end, that team can become longer lived. It can own areas of the code and start to interact with other teams in different ways. So they define these kind of team types and interaction models. and they've come up with 4 so far, and it seemed to work. So we were able, as a business, to look at these 4 team types and start to look at how those teams are structured, and say, well, these guys would be streamlined teams because of X. These guys would become this concept of enabling team. So if they were helping teams to improve their local development environment, or so the GSD team becomes more of maybe an enabling team, or they would help coach streamlined teams to become au fait with infrastructure as code, or the ability to deploy infrastructure, add monitoring, make sure everything was compliant, all those kind of things. They would be educators as opposed to doers. And then also kind of platform level teams where if we needed particular areas of the system that could be delivered as a service to other teams. And then essentially, depending on what needed to be done, we would choose various different interaction modes. So we've got about three or 4 slides left, I think. So really close, just going to run over, unfortunately. When we look at how you might break those teams up, there's various different ways in which you can slice your company. You might decide to create a fracture plane or software boundary around business domains using domain-driven design. But there might be regulatory compliance, or the cadence in which you deliver change to your customer might be a factor that influences how you change or change the team structures. But basically, what you're looking to do is determine whether the architecture results in more autonomy for the team, and whether they can reduce ultimately the cognitive load. Haven't got time to go into cognitive load, but it's a real interesting concept around essentially, as Dan North says, you should develop software that fits in your head. Anything that doesn't fit in your head is extraneous to your mind, and is harder for that team to get their head around. And so if you can start to understand at what point a team becomes stressed because they've got too much going on in their head, the better. One final number, which became apparent as we started to look back at our time. So Dunbar's number is this concept of social interaction mechanisms and team sizes and what works well for people. So high trust can be achieved with kind of close personal relationships with around 5 people. 15 people is that group where you have that experience of deep trust. As you start to hit 50, you've got some kind of mutual trust there, but you don't necessarily know everything about everyone. And if you hit 150, then you can barely remember like what everyone does in the business. So using that number, you can start to make decisions about, well, if our department is over 150 people, then we should split into 2 departments or something like that. So then our new team structure that was going forward at the start of this year was that we had the stream aligned team, so people that focused on acquisition, people focused on retention. We had a payment stream, a gym stream. We kept, due to the cadence of delivery and the mobile side of things, that's kept separate currently. And then we had a couple of enabling teams. But ultimately, what this enabled was that the teams started to become long-lived. They could own areas of the code. They could interact with other teams and work out how they would communicate and collaborate. But ultimately, they could then create a roadmap which included architecture decisions that wasn't limited based on particular projects. And they knew that they would be there longer term. And they could start to make incremental movements towards creating smaller microservices until COVID came along. And so in summary, Yeah, the journey for PureGym hasn't been reached. It will continue. Agile is not a destination. It will continue to evolve. But if you were going to take something away from this, I would recommend try thinking in systems, aim to optimize for flow, endeavor to make work visible as much as you possibly can, encourage that culture of continuous learning, and shape your teams to define your architecture. And with that, are there any questions? 4 minutes over.
Awesome job, Rich. Thank you very much. Well, as Rich said, any questions? Please switch your microphones on, switch the video cameras back on. And I guess if we were all in the same room, we'd give Rich a great whoop and a round of applause. So woo woo! Thank you very much, Rich.
You're welcome.
It's just something that doesn't quite translate to the virtual environment, isn't it?
Can we try glad hands?
Oh, do you know what? If you want to carry on with the Zoom practice, do you know what? We've got the reactions down at the bottom of Zoom, so we can all give Rich.
Oh, look at that. Nice. Look at that. I might just turn my light on so you can actually still see me. Hold on. It's gone a bit dark.
So let's keep clapping. Let's get a group photo. I'll do a screenshot.
I've gone orange.
Right, if anyone wants to open up the microphone. I do have a question, but I realise that I've been interrupting and asking loads of questions already, so I want other people to have a voice. Go on, Andrew.
Richard, what was the role of the program and project manager in all these? A lot of difficulties that you talk about are the ones that I guess people like myself, Stephen, and a few other sort of program project managers would seek to resolve, because we actually look at the value chain right from customer right through product manager, a lot, and we'd work from right to left.
Yep.
From the customer pull, the customer requirement, customer need, company need, and so forth. And therefore, we'd go through that discovery, elaboration, and so forth. So different processes. Where was the program project manager in all this?
Exactly. And that was the big kind of, when you look at the roles within a typical business company, that facility, the PMO, wasn't really existent. It was very much owned by it was owned and driven by the IT team. And we introduced BAs and a delivery manager, but not at that particular level. And that was what we were constantly striving to try to do, is bring that visualization and planning and processing of the further up the chain into the flow.
Okay. I was going to ask the same about product owner. I couldn't see one on your diagram.
Yeah, it was always a big challenge for us, is who is the product owner, and we had multiple stakeholders across the board, and then it was only at the point where we drove them to kind of push towards these longer term product teams where we could say, right, now you own this, because they could visualize that ownership and the longer term view of that. But as an overall product owner, it was non-existent.
Go on, Ian.
Hello. I'm interested in the experiments.
I don't know if you can hear me.
Oh, well, hold on. Yeah, was that Pedro? Pedro?
Yes.
Yeah, Pedro, you go, and then Ian.
Okay. I've actually, well, first of all, thank you very much. This is really, really interesting and really, really useful. And it was great to see. Thank you. And I've got two questions, actually. So the first one is, did you have a vision driven from the top management of the company, or do you think that was sort of missing to help you throughout all of the project management tasks that you had to do?
Yeah, so the vision was there. it just wasn't visible. So part of the challenge, again, coming back to this concept of making work visible, everything was based on a what they called the one-page marketing plan, or one-page plan across all the core business areas, where the senior management team, steering committees would get together and map out the year and decide what the plan was going to be for the year. I didn't have time to go into it today, but ultimately that was kind of captured in PowerPoint presentations, Excel, and email, and very much hidden from everything that we were doing. Ultimately, the projects would come in and say, right, we need a team. You guys go off, do this for X period of time. And so that visibility of what was driven from the top down was part of the challenge that we also tried to solve. And we took the concept of GIST, although that the GIST principles didn't get taken. What we actually did was manipulate the tools they already had and turn them into Kanban boards that they could then manage on a more regular basis. So they had this concept of a what do they call it? A tech radar, project radar, essentially. So every month, it would be this PDF that was kind of like, these are all the things that are on the horizon. And it was like a business meeting of, right, this is what's coming up. And so we had this PowerPoint, these PDFs and Excel documents and things. So we ultimately we then turned those into Kanban boards and a process where we could then link, visualize their goals, which then linked to the core projects that they wanted to deliver, and then ultimately the work that we were then doing, and see a clear delineation from the top down to the bottom. And that certainly helped the teams to buy in to what they were delivering, and make, again, with the product teams being able to see the longer term, you could then engage more with the product owner and understand their goals for the year, and have much more kind of constructive discussion around what they wanted to achieve across the year, and then how we can incrementally deliver parts of the projects or the step projects to deliver on those goals, but also change the architecture and things at the same time. So it was something that was missing for too long, was the visibility of the goals. But again, it kind of came down to the lack of true product owner, and this kind of PMO planning kind of discussion-y bit.
That question, was there a vision? And the answer, yes, it was a hidden vision. And trying to extract that and represent it and make it visible through the GISTs and the other tools you were using, have kind of taken me way too long to realize that actually, as much as possible, leverage the language that they're already using in the business. Don't say, hey, we're going to create a GIST. Understand what they're talking about already, and try and make that thing visible and call it the same thing.
Yes. Yep, that was a big lesson learned for me as well.
Yeah, it takes us too long.
Even though it's exactly the same concepts, it needed to be their terms.
Yeah. And Pedro, did you have another question as well?
Thank you. Yes, the second question is, I can see that there was a lot of process improvement work going on. From my point of view, I really appreciate what you did, and I would say that it's probably as complex as the actual system that you were building. My question is, how did you manage to find the time to do all of that? Was that, I'm wondering whether there was like explicitly agreed, sort of like in the same fashion as a yes, 20% for innovation, or was that something that you had to sort of like do in the background or off hours?
Yeah, no, it's essentially, so we took advantage of that 20% time, and ultimately our innovation was innovation on process. So where possible, we would take that time and say, well, we're going to achieve more efficiency and more capability for the business by focusing on how we deliver software. And so rather than focusing on, say, a new shiny tech thing, let's improve our way of working and our way of delivering, and start to analyze the metrics and understand it internally, so that we can then present back metrics and things that justify reasons why we should be doing things in a certain way.
Well, tell you what then, just to give everyone the chance, in case we need to be with our families tonight, if we've not spent enough time with them over the last few days already. So thank you very much for coming. And I will say thank you very much to Rich for joining us and sharing that. I get the feeling we've just been kind of proofreading your new book. I don't know if that's what this really is.
Hopefully. Well, yeah. As luck would have it, the gym industry got hit quite hard by COVID. So if anyone wants a deeper dive into this stuff, I am currently available.
Got a little bit of time on your hands. Well, and could be well used, I'm sure.